So the key ends up being, how do we stop negative feedback cycles everywhere? And how do we start propagating virtuous cycles? So we want to be able to pull the body levers, the environment levers, the relationship levers, the psyche levers simultaneously.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I'm your host, and this is the 169th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal. This week, we are going to be getting a little bit into futurism, philosophy, complexity science, and the evolution of the medical industry, what things might be looking like in 5, 15, 20 years, what things should be looking like, the intersection of big data and personalized medicine, and last but not least, what all this means for your brain. We're going to be talking with the founder of a group called the Neurohacker Collective, Daniel Schmachtenberger, in the main interview, getting pretty geeky, but also covering some really interesting topics. It's one of those big picture conversations that points out both the horrible ways in which society seems to be running itself off of a cliff, and also the awesome opportunities that we have to radically improve things. I had a great time with this conversation, really appreciated Daniel's ability to kind of shine a light on both the opportunities and the pitfalls that we've got in front of us. So a good interview coming up and somewhat of a longer episode this time. If you're exhausted by the end of the interview and just need to get some sleep, hang around until the end of the episode. I'm going to tell you what sleeping position actually proves to be best for your brain. Believe it or not, the position that you sleep in, as well as just about everything else about sleep, can make a quantitative difference in your brain health. This is true at least if you are a rat, but probably true for people as well. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But as usual, let's kick things off first with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So it's always nice to see a Smart Drug Smarts alumnus in the news, and I wanted to get this one in there. This is not actually a This Week in Neuroscience, but a late last year in neuroscience. But the lead author of this paper that was recently published in the journal with a cool name, Brain Stimulation, was none other than Dr. Martin Monti of UCLA, who we spoke with on a twofer episode where we interviewed both him and Dr. Kathleen Bell about traumatic brain injury. This was probably 10, 15 episodes ago at this point. But right around that same time, Dr. Monti was also helping a 25-year-old man who was in a coma recover and break out of that coma through a never-before-used technique called low-intensity focused ultrasound pulsation, which in layman's terms jump-started his brain out of the coma using sonic stimulation to excite neurons in the brain's thalamus. Prior to last year, the closest thing that neurologists had been able to accomplish to this was using DBS, deep brain stimulation, which is a surgical procedure which is invasive. But what Monti and his group did was a purely non-invasive technique using a device about the size of a coffee cup saucer, which created a small sphere of acoustical energy that could be aimed at different regions of the brain to excite the brain tissue there. In this case, they targeted the thalamus, which is a region in which the performance is typically vastly diminished in patients suffering from coma. The changes in the patient, according to Monti, were remarkable. Prior to the procedure, the man showed only minimal signs of being conscious and understanding speech. He could perform small, limited movements, but by 3 days after the procedure, he'd regained full consciousness and full language comprehension. He could reliably respond to doctors by nodding yes, shaking his head no, and he even made a fist bump gesture to say goodbye to one of his doctors who left the room. According to Dr. Monti, the researchers expected a positive result with this technique, but he cautioned that the procedure requires further study on additional patients before this could become a standard of care. It's possible, he said, that we were just very lucky and happened to have stimulated the patient just as he was spontaneously recovering. The device used emits only a small amount of energy, and it worked just by turning it on in 30-second blocks 10 times over a 10-minute period. So 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for 10 minutes, that was enough to stimulate the thalamus. According to Monti, if things work out, this could eventually be built into a portable device, such as a helmet that could be used to wake up coma patients or other people in vegetative states.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes this week, although I'm only going to give you one of them now because I've got a couple other things I want to go over. Nick in the House 96 from the USA says, the science behind these podcasts is incredibly accurate. I wish I would have known about these podcasts in my chemical engineering undergrad courses. Probably the most educational podcast I've ever listened to. I also heard from a listener who can do something called mirror writing, which is a type of ambidexterity where somebody can write with both hands simultaneously, with their right hand and their left hand doing exact mirror images of one another. So me, for example, I would be able to write my name perfectly forward with my right hand and simultaneously be writing a backward version of it with my left hand. She says that she's been able to do this her entire life. In fact, when she was in high school, she would take notes backward with her left hand just because she was able to, and presumably to weird out her friends. She does, however, have a hard time writing forward with her left left-hand. And anyway, she said that there's very little information available about this on the internet, and she wanted to know how common this is and if maybe some other listeners were able to do this or at least knew something about it. I said that sounded cool enough to mention on the next episode, so if there are any other mirror writers in the audience, definitely drop me an email. I will get you guys connected. Finally, I also heard from a couple of people over the course of this week about last week's episode when there was a little bit of a sideways jab from the guest, Dr. Gary Wank, about running and how runners are oftentimes physically injured as a result of their running. Some people got probably justifiably huffy about this, that normally it's bad running form and more frequently bad running shoes that lead to runners' injuries. And a couple of people mentioned by name the book by Christopher McDougall from a couple of years ago, Born to Run, which is a good book. I'll vouch for that. Very, very entertaining read. And among other things, he comes down really hard on Nike as fomenting a style of running with landing on your heels that is not good for human feet. But anyway, this is not a cross-training or a shoe comparison podcast, so I won't go too deeply into that, but did want to let the popular discontent be heard and not scare anybody away from running. If you might have been thinking of doing some running and last week's podcast talked you out of it, you might want to think about that one more time. While you're out there exerting energy on your run, making use of your mitochondria, I would be remiss if I did not mention Mitogen by Axon Labs. 6 ingredients there, including idebenone, sulbuthiamine, bio-PQQ, and more. A synergistic blend to load up your mitochondria with precursors and proliferate the number of mitochondria that you've got. Very handy for everything from running to thinking and anything in between. You can find Mitogen and its sister stack Nexus, which is a cognitive stack. Both of those over at axonlabs.io on the web, or if you're at the Smart Drug Smarts homepage, we got a shop link in our header. Axon Labs runs 24/7, 365 days a year. And every now and then little special things go on worth knowing about. Time-boxed deals and such. The best way to find out about those, of course, is to follow what's going on Smart Drug Smarts' various social media channels or our newsletter, The Brain Breakfast, where we often give first whiff when we've got something new going on. You can sign up for that over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. That's just about all, so let's jump ahead now to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Daniel Schmachtenberger. He is the founder of something called the Neurohacker Collective, the creators of a nootropic supplement that hit the market last year called Qualia. If you're a nootropics fan, you've probably seen Qualia ads on some websites, but Qualia is just the most visible tip of a fairly large iceberg that they've got going on over at the Neurohacker Collective. An iceberg which I'm about to ruin the iceberg metaphor, but is slowly surfacing and revealing more and more of itself to the world. Daniel Schmachtenberger and his team have very, very large-scale plans for upregulating human cognition, the human condition in general. I think you would probably not blush to say that he is on a mission to save the world, change the world certainly, and he believes that we've reached a point in science where reductionism and deconstructing things is probably reached about the end of its usefulness in most cases, and where using a big data whole systems approach is probably the best way forward in a lot of major endeavors like medicine. So what this is going to be is a bit of a hodgepodge conversation around future of medicine, systems science, nootropic stack design, how society should be thinking about IP law, and on and on. There's one technical term which gets dropped here, which is a shit ton of data, which I think has never been used on this show before, but it's a keeper. Lots and lots of talk about big data, and a fun little fact about Neurohacker's product Qualia. If that word Qualia sounds familiar, it's an old one. It is actually the plural form of quali, which is defined as a property such as whiteness, which can be considered independently of the thing having the property. So you could talk about the quali softness of a blanket, but leave out the blanket. Thought that was a pretty cool name. Now the man that came up with that name, Daniel Schmachtenberger.
One of the key distinctions between complicated systems and complex systems is self-organization. And when you have a self-organizing system, when you look at a cell, it was not designed exogenously like a computer chip was. So they had fundamentally different processes of coming about. So complex systems are the result of self-interacting dynamics and evolutionary processes. So you have self-interacting dynamics, and the things that are effective end up getting selected for, and then you keep having these increased effectiveness selection dynamics. And one of the interesting things about self-organizing systems is the way they have non-arbitrary boundaries. The relationship of the cell to the world around it, the plant, the animal, whatever it is, to the rest of the world around it has a non-arbitrary boundary where you have the agency of that system being able to move within the environment, externalize entropy outside of the system, and have sensory input of some kind, information processing, and actuator output. Complicated systems are totally different in all of those processes. The advent of what we we call modern science, with Galileo, Descartes, really codified with Newton and going beyond, started working with small variable systems where you had an angle and how much gunpowder, and that was really all that was needed. And in those small variable systems, classical mechanics and specifically reductionism, taking a very complex idea like how do we win a war, finding a couple key variables, bringing it all down to those key variables was super useful, right? It was so useful. We didn't need dowsing rods anymore. We didn't need guesses. In fact, it was so much more effective than all those systems that it became the dominant system for knowing how to do things. And we started being able to get into systems that had more variables than just a couple. But then as you start to encounter the natural world, the biological world, and you start to deal with complex systems where you have not just a slightly larger number of, but still distinct variables, but you have nearly indefinite number of variables. You have bottom-up and top-down effects. They're all radically interacting where they co-evolved in such a way that the variables it studied in isolation actually do different things than they do in synergy, in combinatorics of that context. So context ends up defining the thing very profoundly. Then just looking at a small number of variables and then putting it back together and not realizing that those variables actually do different things in isolation than they did together, and they do different things with synergies of them than they did separately, doesn't end up being adequate. Our systems of medicine have done really good where the cause of illness were small number of variable causes, like acute illness, right? The issue comes from a bullet wound or a car accident or something where you can't trace the causation to something fairly acute. Then we're pretty good at being able to reverse that, and that's where Western medicine has really proliferated. But if you have cancer or autoimmune disease or neurodegenerative disease or any kind of complex chronic scenarios that are multifactorial, there might be some elements of toxicity involved, some elements of pathogenicity, some elements of deficiency, some genetics, some psychoneuroimmunology, like lots of things with delayed causation over time and then causal cascades where many different elements are interacting. We aren't able to trace the etiology of them. We're also looking for it to be the same etiology, that MS is one thing, that anxiety is one thing, and it's not. It is a set of similar-ish symptoms that can have not only many different causes, but different sets of those causes in different people in different contexts. We need fundamentally different epistemology, different processes of knowing and studying to do a good job with those kinds of things.
A lot of people are going to be nodding and following along, agreeing with that in principle, but also saying, yes, but everything that we hear from neuroscience is that the brain is still this really complicated, partially unknown frontier. And if there's maybe one area of science where we don't know enough of the fine, minute specifics yet to be able to move away from reductionism, the brain might be it. Would you disagree with that statement? Would you think that we're near some sort of swing point or tipping point? What's your general thoughts there?
I would say we need to frame up the topic differently. So in reductionism, our goal is to take a complex system and break it down into subsystems that are simpler and break those down into subsystems. And that's the direction of specialization. So we take health and we look at neurology and gastroenterology and oncology and rheumatology, right? We break the body into these kinds of anatomical tract systems, try to understand those. One of the problems ends up being here that you can have gut issues that a gastroenterologist should be looking at that are affecting brain issues via gut-brain axis dynamics, via microbiome, via enteric nervous system, right? Like so many different dynamics. And so the cross-system effects, it's actually a reason that there's an assumption that whole systems effects are harder and further away epistemologically from here than reductionist answers. And I'm actually saying that reductionist answers are infinitely far away because they can never solve these things. Ultimately, we'll always be reductionist in that we will always be looking at a subset of everything that is involved.
Yeah.
We're never going to know that every variable that's involved we have perfect confidence margins on. So we're reducing the whole to some subset, but the key is that we seek to have that be not only a growing subset, but that we understand the interconnectedness more. Obviously, we've been in Western allopathic medicine and science in general trying to understand more and more variables, understanding all the complex interactions between them and how they self-organize. Complex, not complicated interactions, applying a different kind of thinking to how it emerged that way is where we have a lot of room for growth right now. And that's the whole systems biology movement. So we move from these anatomical tracks to these similarly causal worlds of looking at the body. Genomics, microbiomics, transcriptomics, connectomics, the whole world of things like this that are involved at a level of self-organization. We're very far away from understanding the human connectome or the human genome adequately, even though we've sequenced the genome, combinatorics on those genes, and then gene expression, and then recursion at the level of what's happening in the blood to changing gene expression is something that we're quite far from.
Owning a book versus being an expert in that book and what the author actually meant and all the various interpretations are two very different things.
Very different things. But the movement to start trying to take what seem like very different areas of study and understand how this one one system evolved to have all of these parts interacting is, I would say, one of the frontiers of the biological sciences right now.
Your organization has the great name. You got neurohacker.com, but it is named the Neurohacker Collective. Why did you choose the neuro? Why draw that particular circle of emphasis for yourself?
So Neurohacker Collective was born out of a think tank that was working on complex system problem solving for all of the major complex systems at a civilization level. So we were working on future of economics, where the incentive of all agents is aligned with the well-being of other agents in the common. We were working on governance, so better systems of decision making. And we were working on infrastructure to have closed loop infrastructure where there's no waste or need for ongoing unsustainable materials acquisition, etc. And we were working on how do we make sure that we have models that are really adequate for where humanity's going. And once it was time to start building some of these, we've done work in a number of the areas. The reason why we decided to invest a lot in the psychoneurospace early, and we're still working on all of those spaces interconnectedly, but why the psychoneurospace is so important is a couple reasons. One is all the problems that we see in the world that we would want to change, whether we're talking about overfishing of the oceans or biodiversity loss or war or crazy fundamentalism or crime or anything, all these problems are being caused by human activity. And human activity is being predisposed by lots of things. Economics are predisposing it, but physiology is part of what's predisposing it. Everyone knows that when their hormones are really out of place, their neurotransmitters are out of place, that not only do they feel shittier, but they're likely to act differently and different in potentially less good ways. Well, that ends up going all the way to the level of psychopathy. Empathy is mediated over certain neural networks, and it can be up or down regulated. Complex problem solving is mediated over certain neural networks and can be more or less capable. So the hardware that human consciousness and decision making runs on is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so not only are all the problems predisposed by human action, but all the solutions are going to have to come through human action. And so how do we elevate the collective intelligence and the collective experience and positive predisposition of humanity is a bandwidth limiting factor for all critical things. And so working at this level of helping to upregulate human experience and human capability ends up being a very highly leveraged thing to do for everything else. Because then as you take people who want to do positive things and empower them at a hardware level, more positive things get to happen in a distributed, decentralized way. The other reason why we wanted to work on it is because it's very complex. And the more complex it is, the degree to which you succeed there means that those same tools can be repurposed to other things.
What is a specific problem that you would like to solve that you're working to solve now?
We are working on psychoneurotopics. And what we can share publicly is things where we're kind of able to offer direct to people enhancement technologies. Medical technologies obviously have to go through a whole legal process for what it means to clear those as medical technologies, but we're working on the research of it deeply. And so when we're talking about psychoneuro, we're talking about neurodegenerative things and kind of psychiatric things where you have to deal with not only the brain and the nervous system, which is more complex in terms of orders of magnitude of total interactions happening than any other body system, but you also have to deal with the whole rest of the body system in which it's embedded, and you have to deal with the interface with the psyche. Radically harder kind of science, because science doesn't deal with psyches well. It doesn't deal with subjective stuff, so it will only deal with the objective correlates of the subjective stuff, because that's what science evolved to do. And so having to deal with subject-object interface plus the complexity of the objective, we started there because it was an area both where you can alleviate the most suffering, enhance human capability the most, and if you can do well there, you can do well with things that are relatively easy, like cancer and autoimmune disease, and other aspects of human optimization. But so let's take a single example. Let's take anxiety. But I could have just as easily said Alzheimer's or MS or sleep disorders or anything, right?
Sure.
Let's say we're going to take anxiety, which is obviously pretty ubiquitous right now and growingly ubiquitous. Then we say, well, how do we fix anxiety? Well, psychiatric answer has been give a benzodiazepine. This obviously doesn't address underlying cause at all. But in the process of not addressing underlying cause and just saying there's something wrong with their GABA circuitry, let's make a much, much, much stronger GABA receptor agonist exogenously. You exogenously, externally override an endogenous system that you just deemed broken without understanding what was wrong with it.
Yeah.
And then in the process of doing that, create more dependence on that exogenous thing. And then you fix the level of one in-chain chemical, like what's happening at a GABA receptor, independent of the complexity of things it's normally interacting with, which ends up meaning you throw off a bunch of ratios, you throw off a bunch of causal chains, and so you get side effects. So those kinds of single molecule interventions not only don't deal with cause, so the underlying pathogenesis can get worse, but they end up leading to oftentimes increased dependence and side effects. So obviously an adequate approach to anxiety has to understand cause and understand all the possibilities of cause and understand them uniquely in each person, and then have treatments that are customized to all the different things that can go on. And for example, that would look like how much of a particular person's anxiety is psychogenic in origin and how much is physiogenic might be a first question. Physiogenic meaning the origin is primarily physical. Psychogenic meaning the origin is primarily psychological.
If an axe murderer is chasing you, you should be anxious.
Right. And if an axe murderer chased you and you got acute PTSD from that that's continuing to loop, that's very different than, and so now you've got anxiety afterwards from that kind of acute PTSD. That's very different than if you start having anxiety after head trauma, where you actually damage some neural networks, or if you've always had anxiety that's maybe related to genetic predispositions for methylation disorders, or if you got your anxiety primarily after getting a parasite, which caused a gut-brain axis disorder, so your GABA production in your gut is lower, or et cetera, et cetera. So we find that there are thousands of physiologic contributing factors to what we call anxiety, and potentially thousands of different kinds of psychogenic factors. And there's different kinds of psychotherapeutic process and different kinds of medical process and health process that are more effective for different sub-elements. So then you have to say, well, can we map the entire space of things that correlate with anxiety that could be causal? And then can we figure out how to do differential diagnosis across all of them to see exactly which things are going on for this person, which weighted subset of which elements? And then can we map our treatments to the specific pathways, not to the end symptomology? So then which combinations of treatments and which order of operations can all be prioritized and personalized, factoring everything that is known.
Which sounds like you've got to be drinking data from some large streams in order to try to have a reasonable guess based on all those different types of data inputs that you'd want.
Well, so you're looking at, say there was head trauma involved, you've got to have some kinds of appropriate brain scans. Is it QEEG? Is it SPECT scan? Is it et cetera? And how do you get that? Or you might simply look at behavioral scans, cognitive, psychoaffective scans that we have found over enough time correlate well enough to a specific kind of trauma. To the degree that it's genetic in predisposition, we've got to be looking at whole genome sequencing and maybe at the level of gene expression, transcriptomics or proteomics. Or to the degree that we're looking at mold toxicity that causes excitotoxicity in the nervous system and anxiety, we have to be looking at the kind of clinical chemistry that gives us toxicity and pathology, right? That's a lot of data. And right now, it's hard to even get it. We don't have high enough sensitivity and specificity on everything, and it's stupidly expensive, and then you can't get it often enough to see what's working. So that's a diagnosis issue. We have to get better and better diagnostic systems. So this is something that we're very focused on, both what's happening at the cutting edge of all different kinds of diagnostics that we can synthesize. How can we help diagnostics get better towards adequate? And then once we have this shit ton of data, the interpretation layer is how do we actually interpret all that data, where you aren't just looking at each biometric in relationship to a reference range, but you're looking at each biometric in relationship to all the other biometrics and psychometrics to see intercausal effects. That's ultimately a kind of AI processing a shit ton of diagnostic data, psychometric and physiogenic data, that then leads to a process where we have to have synthesized all of the treatments that have been vetted as having some efficacy, and then relating those down to the pathways over which they have efficacy, and then being able to customize. That, though, is a decent baseline description of the future of complex medicine, personalized medicine.
What's that going to look like? Are those data sets going to be publicly available to some extent, or are these going to be developed almost like by rival hospitals or rival medical groups selling access to their own particular live data sets? This is asking you to speculate. Obviously, nobody's got the magic wand here.
Let me go a little bit higher for a minute, because the question you asked spoke to it. Medicine within capitalism is broken, inexorably and unavoidably, because the theory of markets should not apply to something where people don't actually have a viable choice. For-profit prisons are a problem, right? One should not have a profit incentive that is against the liberty of the populace.
Right.
For-profit military-industrial complex is a problem.
Let me question that for a second, though. It seems like if you actually completely flipped the model, for example, paid a doctor for every month that you were perfectly healthy and you had no complaints, if the incentives were different, it seems like maybe the system, while not being perfect, could still be radically better than what it is now and still be a capitalist system.
So this is the key thing. That is a foundationally different system.
Yeah.
It is actually paying for health rather than paying for sickness services, right?
That's true.
So when you really start to get into what it would take to do that, there's a lot of problems, right? Because you get, well, individual responsibility of the people being problematic. You get to have an adequate system. I won't say what it takes to actually structure it right now because we'll have to dive down some deep economics rabbit holes, but we should do that sometime if you want. You do have to make sure that you don't have anywhere within the research or science or medical or regulation process an incentive for anything less than robust health and illness prevention.
Right.
And that's even things like right now, the IP is such that I've got to put in a shit ton of money up front in drug development. To ever make that money back, I've got to be able to patent my stuff so that I can charge a really high price as opposed to market competition on it, which means I can only pursue patentable things. So plans are out. Diet, exercise, right there, out of getting that level of research funding. And I've got to do single molecules going through a clinical trial. But the clinical trial shows can never do personalized medicine, right? Because I have some effect over a bell curve, but some people are on the back of the bell curve, some are on the front of the bell curve. I'm simply looking at, does this one molecule intervening in one part of a very complex dynamic cause something other than placebo? And of course, then all kind of problems associated. So everything down to the level of IP law change to where the incentives are perfectly aligned with collective well-being.
There's probably several revolutions. I was going to say a revolution, but there's probably multiple revolutions necessary for that.
Yes. So you think about it. Our underlying IP law is broken, right? We can patent single molecules that are synthetic, not complexes of molecules that are varying for individual people in a way that a clinical trial could never do because we're doing N=1 optimization, not molecules that came from natural sources, right? So the IP structure is broken. The clinical trial epistemology itself is inadequate for personalized medicine. The incentive systems where you're maximizing the lifetime revenue of a customer and a customer happens to be a patient, which means start them on meds younger and have more cross-sell, upsell, which is the side effects to other meds. All that's broken, but also the underlying epistemology of system reductionism is broken. So medicine has gotten as far as it has, and it is now more of a problem to chronic health. It's still great for acute health than it is a asset. And to transcend it, the revolutions are new science, new understanding of what IP means, new regulation, new economics. All those things have to change.
That's a really interesting point that you just made, and I guess I kind of want to go back and underscore it, that for acute health, medicine is still very useful and is probably still arguably making significant progress year after year, decade after decade. But for ongoing health, day-to-day, how you feel, what your non-emergency medical care is like, is either flatlined or possibly getting worse. I wonder when that shift took place, what year, what decade it would have been, because you could almost kind of feel that the average health of a random 35-year-old in middle America is probably worse now than it was 20 years ago.
Well, we see declining sperm rates at the industrialized world that are related to xenoestrogens in the plastics, pesticides that are endocrine disruptors, et cetera, et cetera. We see that the average mother in the United States has hundreds of petrochemical traces in her breast milk, which means what's happening at the neurotoxic and carcinogenic level of infants. So let's go to a level even higher than everything we talked about so far. What are the tier 1 causes of illness? Tier 1 meaning the initial deviation from homeostasis, because we can define health from a cybernetic perspective, a complex regulatory system perspective. We can define health as the total resilience and homeostatic capacity, this regulatory system across all of its regulatory axes. We didn't say the homeostasis, we said the homeostatic capacity. How much deviation from homeostasis in terms of impulse can come that it can actually process and stay within healthy ranges.
So to put that in layman's terms, if you think of your body as a bunch of springs, if I move the ball at the center of the springs away from the center, how quickly and easily does it kind of shake itself back into a center position?
Yeah. Most of the time when we do labs, we're looking at, is someone's glucose in range? Is it too high or too low? We're looking at homeostasis. We're not doing a stress test where we give someone then a lot of sugar or little sugar, and we're testing then how well does it stay in range in proximity to stresses, right? So the actual homeostatic capacity that determines the resilience of the system is one of the major things we need to pay a lot more attention to. So then we can say that's health. Aging is the decreased resilience of the system. You can be totally healthy and aged, but smaller deviations from homeostasis can take you out of health, like falling and breaking a hip or whatever, right? You don't have current pathology, but you have less resilience to pathological inputs. So we're defining disease and aging fundamentally differently. Disease is some deviation from homeostasis input that exceeded the homeostatic capacity of the system that led to altered functioning, pathophysiology.
Right.
So the tier 1 deviation, sometimes we'll say, okay, this autoimmune disease is preceded by increased inflammatory markers. So inflammation caused it. Well, no. Inflammation was part of a causal cascade. Inflammation is a signaling molecule that responds to some tissue being irritated by something, right? So there's something higher in the causal chain. The initial deviation from homeostasis will always be the way that the organism interfaces with its environment over the overarching behavior of the organism. So either the organism takes in too much of something it shouldn't from the environment, toxins, pathogens, or things that are good but in excess amounts, sugar, calories, etc. It doesn't take in enough of something from the environment that it needs to, deficiency. Its fundamental code is not optimized, genetics, microbiomics, right, epigenetics that are passed down, or the overarching behavior of the system is off. Stress, psychoneuroimmunological stress, right, the way the psyche affects it, or not exercising, lifestyle, posture, those kinds of things. So you can always trace back the hormones that are off, or the inflammation markers that are off, or the whatever, to some of those tier 1 causes. Now, let's look at toxicity for a minute. We live in houses where we spend 90% of our time indoors, and the paint has so many VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and the flooring does, and the carpet does, and all of those volatile organic compounds are either carcinogens or neurotoxin or endocrine disruptors or something like that. We are outside, and the smog from the cars has mercury in it, has zinc and nitric oxide in it, has the food that we're eating is grown in soil that is both microbiome depleted and trace mineral depleted. The way that we have affected our environment, we have made an environment that we are not genetically adapted to. And one of the interesting things about humans is we get to evolve one generation to the next profoundly on the same genome because our genome evolved to do mimetic evolution, quick processing, neuroplastic evolution without having to change genome. And that leads to tools where we change our environment faster than we can adapt to it. So when you look at the tier 1 issues in health, it's not just an issue of like we're less healthy because medicine was bad. Before medicine, we have built a world that is not healthy for people. And so can you have optimized healthy people in a biosphere that is environmentally toxic on so many metrics, topsoil deficient, etc. So ultimately, when we talk about the future of medicine, one of the big things has to be the future of how we do infrastructure and recreating a built world that is optimizing for the quality of life of the beings in that world.
Very much agree. What's your real world best guess as how probably 2 steps forward, 1 step back at some points, technology will still be progressing and public health will be moving forward?
In terms of the things that fairly easy to predict within current systems technologically advancing, I'll say diagnostics are going to get a lot better. And so whole genome sequencing is going to get cheap enough that it replaces just partial genome SNP analysis. And so that'll become ubiquitous. We'll have whole genomes on everybody, or the availability to have that. Metabolomics is going to get good and inexpensive, and the interpretations on metabolomics, as well as some aspects of transcriptomics, proteomics. So we start understanding the expression layer. Well, those are all going to become good, as well as microbiomics.
Some of those omics, let's actually stop and sort of give people the bullet point, quick definitions of those. Like proteomics is the folding of proteins. What is metabolomics?
So we're actually looking at the metabolic byproducts of different types of cells, what we can understand about what's happening with the cells based on those metabolic byproducts. So we can understand different dysfunctions of cell types and different functions of cell types based on the metabolites and the total amount and relative ratio and proportions of different metabolites. One of the cool things about metabolomics is you can assess a lot. You can infer things about toxicity because toxins change cell processes in predictable ways. Pathogens change cell process. Deficiency does. Inflammation does. Oxidative stress does. So you can infer a lot of those things from the metabolites. And instead of where most of our blood chemistry right now requires taking blood and then spinning it a particular way, putting particular reagents in, so you have to run a lot of vials of blood if you want to get good insights. The metabolomics is very likely to be accessible in the not too distant future via mass spec technology, which means things like home urine units where you start getting a lot of data every morning. I think home medical assessment, you can see the X Prize working on tricorders. Gene Radar from NanoBioSim gives the ability to do PCR level diagnostics with a drop of blood.
Wow.
Across a lot of things. I think laser interferometry, where just a laser beam goes through your skin into your blood, and then the scattering pattern that comes back gives insights about what's in the blood. I think there's a very good chance that will get a lot better. So the ability to start getting a tremendous amount of data very frequently, and then being able to do big data processing across people, but even big data on the same person, because you can get so much data so frequently. And, whenever an illness comes, you do retrospectives on it and see what were the first deviations that you could see. That's going to be one of the major things that happens that's game changing. Say you've got like an autoimmune antibody emerging or inflammatory marker biomarkers or immune differentiation problems. But you find that before that happened, you had a tiny little change in the ratio of endogenous opioids. You look at those together, but then you start understanding, oh, do opioids play a top-down relationship in immune modulation? And then you get to start seeing this tiny little opioid change way pre-symptomology and being able to help it then, and then you don't develop autoimmune disease. That as one example of many different kinds of pathogenesis that we'll start to gain insights into, and some that people in integrative medicine already have insights into, but it's hard to scale it because, if you're going to see a really good integrative physician and they're working across a lot of things, they're looking at vector-borne illnesses and mold stuff and toxicity stuff and microbiome stuff, you're spending a lot of money and there's a lot of concierge care, or it's not that good yet. And so now imagine it getting way better than concierge care is, because you get so much more data and so much interpretation understanding, but then scalable for everybody.
To a large extent, personalized medicine is really treating us each as special little snowflakes, but then holding that up against this idea that we have 90% of our genes are the same as a stalk of corn. And how do we reconcile those two ideas?
Complexity theory, chaos, which is the tiniest changes in the initial conditions of a complex system lead to huge and unpredictable changes later down the chain and end results. So we can be almost the same, but those tiny changes end up making fundamental ontologic differences. So what's so beautiful about this from a philosophic point of view is we can get that we are almost the same as everyone else and almost the same as all the other animals. So we get to recognize this profound interconnectedness that leads to empathy and a sense of interinvestedness while holding the absolute uniqueness of every single thing, which leads to everything being irreplaceably precious. And that combination is both true. We're fundamentally interconnected, mostly the same, expressions of the same underlying stuff, and utterly irreplaceable.
It's an interesting dichotomy. And the fact that both are two sides of the same coin is pretty fascinating.
That specific concept regarding dichotomy is one of the key things that we actually have to get better at in medicine, which is health based on bottom-up effects where understanding the genome is enough for everything, or there are a lot of top-down effects where you actually have to understand the neuroendocrine system and the connectome. Both. There's bottom-up effects and top-down effects that lead to very complex feedback patterns. Is psychology affecting our bodies? Yes. Are our bodies affecting our psyche? Yes. Leading to feedback patterns that can vicious cycle or virtuous cycle. So there's a lot of what seem like competing truths that are actually not competing. They're complementary parts of more complex systems that we have to understand better.
That's an interesting question. So given that we'll probably find not necessarily just treating people that have conditions that they'd like better, but also looking at ways of optimizing things, people that are looking for performance enhancements, there could be either psychological or chemical, physiological, sort of more process-oriented approaches. If we've got various handles on approaching a change, how do we decide which handle to work from?
Fantastic question. When we talk about the future of medicine, we usually think about going from illness to baseline. Optimization is evolving the baseline. We have thought about optimization in the past in a zero-sum way, which means the total capacity of the system is fairly fixed. So if you evolve one thing, it's usually at the cost of something else, right? You can take steroids and get buff, but you're going to die faster. You can take Adderall and enhance your focus, but it's going to be at the cost of empathy or irritability or something else. Those enhancements are not that interesting. Those were the early, complicated, not complex approaches where we tried to lift one variable rather than lift the resilience and information processing capacity of the whole system. That's the key thing when we start understanding complex systems is, can you increase the net resilience of the entire system where you are increasing the empathy and the focus at the same time, where you're increasing the muscle density and longevity at the same time? The answer is yes. And it's a fundamentally different optimization approach. And then medicine, which is preventing illness and reversing illness, to baseline, enhancing baseline, which is kind of a biologic transhumanism, if you want to think about it, how we evolve ourselves and develop ourselves to further capacities. Those actually become gradients of the same system. And then the question, where do you do psychological stuff and where do you do physiologic stuff, is actually the same as where do you do within physiology bottom-up stuff at the level of cell energy versus top-down stuff at the level of connectomics and brain patterns. The answer is all of them. You end up getting positive feedback loops across all of them, right? You make a healthier brain at a neurohormonal, neurotransmitter level, it predisposes more positive emotions, perspectives, etc. You do work at a meaning-making, cognitive behavioral therapy. So everybody's experienced where you're feeling off physiologically because you sprained your ankle so you can't work out, or because you are hungover or you're sick or whatever, which then because you're feeling not positive physiologically becomes a state. And there's an emotional kind of effect of that. And then you start to perceive your life through that state. And it's kind of like shit-colored glasses. So then as you're perceiving living life through that state, you start to have more negative thoughts, which lead to more negative emotions, which then have an actual stress effect on the body, leading to worse physiology, and you get a vicious cycle. And that could start on the body side or on the emotion side. Either side is enough to be able to start a propagating process. You can also propagate up, where someone starts exercising, leading to better ways of thinking, leading to making new decisions about how one is going to think and feel, etc. So the key ends up being, how do we stop negative feedback cycles everywhere? And how do we start virtuous cycles, propagating virtuous cycles? So we want to be able to pull the body levers, the environment levers, the relationship levers, the psyche levers simultaneously. Now, which ones are going to provide the most lift for an individual is going to be different for different cases, which is where you need to do personalized assessment. And we call it diagnosis if it's illness, but we would call it assessment if it's optimization. So we're doing kind of assessment on someone's physiometrics and psychometrics, and we see that there are particular biologic processes that are significantly off that we can actually intervene in and lift those. Lifting the things where there's most issue is going to lift the whole system the most. And so this starts to get into, how do we do advanced human development? It's a combination of everything and the things that are going to be the most leveraged for that person based on assessment. This not only leads to the future of medicine and the future of biohacking and neurohacking and the future of psychotherapy, and even what you could call spirituality or personal development, but even the future of education. How do you optimize the learning and evolution of a particular child or a particular person in a way that is both unique to their path and optimized for what they can uptake?
It's interesting because it almost seems like this is a threat to the way that technical professional specialization works in our modern world, because it's moving to such a multidisciplinary approach to almost everything. I mean, I could see if I'm an orthopedic surgeon, well, all of a sudden I'm going to have psychologists having advice on what I do. It's like, well, wait a minute, this is my turf. It seems like to apply some of these ideas would mean massive second and third order changes with sort of the way that society operates.
Yes. Most specialists will be replaced by robots of all kinds. So Da Vinci is a better surgeon than handheld surgeons, and it's going to keep getting better. Doesn't shake, has more precision, has optics that can go into a much deeper level of microscopic data than human eyes can. So whether it's being operated by humans still or operated by algorithms, individual specialty things that are highly specialized are going to be automated, because one of the things that humans do well is understanding generality and then being able to build tools to do it better than us. The hammer bangs better than our fist, right? In addition to fully specialized things being automated, which leaves humans to more understanding how the parts interact and the generalities, to the degree that it's a specialized task, but that still is quite complex and humans are going to be involved in it, they will be interfacing with other humans and other disciplines and with AI systems that are interfacing with the data from those other systems. So this is not what we call AI in terms of the strong AI, it's a conscious machine, but what we call symbiotic intelligence, where the intelligence of the humans and the intelligence of the computing processing power together provide the augmented capability. Because as long as we're saying my turf and we are not wanting to understand other things that are actually causal, then we're failing.
Right.
And so the key is causal closure. How do we understand everything that is causally affecting what we're working on? And then how do we understand everything that is causally affected by what we're working on, so we are not missing causation in the process or then causing externalized harm somewhere else?
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Daniel Schmachtenberger for taking the time for that conversation. Really interesting. Daniel is one of the few guests we've had on this show who does not have either an MD or a PhD following his name. Obviously a very, very smart, educated guy, and not without credentials. Obviously something more of an entrepreneur than an academic. But one of those guys who, after talking with him, I just can't imagine him doing his laundry or flossing or doing any of these kind of like low-level human activities that inevitably everybody does from time to time. Just seems to really be walking the walk as far as big picture thinking and taking it upon himself to be Atlas and push the species forward. I have a lot of respect for that and really look forward to seeing what Neurohacker Collective is doing next. They are over at neurohacker.com. We've also got a link over there on the webpage for this episode at smartdrugsmarts.com/169. And should you want to try out Qualia, Daniel and the Neurohacker Collective folks have given us the discount code SDS, short for Smart Drug Smarts, which will get you some savings off the Qualia Nootropic, which has a jaw-dropping 42 different ingredients. But again, you can see what that's all about at smartdrugsmarts.com/169. But now, giving your brain a little rest, let's talk about the proper way to sleep in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So proper sleep hygiene is becoming somewhat of a cottage industry these days. There are no lack of studies looking at how to get a proper night's sleep or a proper daytime sleep if you're talking about naps. But most of the time we're talking about light exposure and electromagnetic shielding and making sure that the room is absolutely silent, things like that. One thing that there's not a lot of buzz about is the actual position a person sleeps in. Sometimes you hear this with regards to snoring and sleep apnea, things like that. But apparently sleep position can make somewhat of a direct difference in your brain health as well. You've probably heard of amyloid beta plaques. These are some of the nasty bad guys that are partially responsible for Alzheimer's disease. They go evil hand in evil hand with neurofibrillary tangles. But at nighttime during sleep, along with other things going on within the brain, natural processes are working to clear the brain of any amyloid beta plaques that might have built up during the day. This is something that's easier done during sleep than during wake because during sleep and any period of restfulness, the brain's interstitial space volume actually expands a little bit, meaning that the glymphatic pathways, which are basically the exit route for these plaques, they widen, so a little one-lane highway can become more like a three-lane highway, ushering these bad molecules out. Researchers used fluorescence microscopy and radioactive tracers to look at the brains of rodents who slept in various positions: supine, prone, and lateral. Lateral being the side sleeping position, which is preferred by many rodents and many humans as well. And it turned out that for widening glymphatic pathways and helping the amyloid betas move out of the brain, the side sleeping position was the unquestioned winner, which is kind of nice because sleep experts also recommend side sleeping for better posture and less back pain. So what to do if side sleeping is not necessarily your thing? Some people prefer sleeping on their back or even sleeping on their stomach. I admit that I really like sleeping on my back during naps. But if getting in the habit of side sleeping is difficult, researchers recommend putting a pillow behind you or in front of you to keep you from rolling onto your front or your back. This also works with a compliant bed partner. And over the long run, this is one of these small little lifestyle changes that could make you a little less likely to wind up with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, or several other neurological conditions that stem partially from too much sludge building up in the brain.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, so that's it for episode number 169. Thank you for hanging around until the very end of the episode. If you're curious about the links to anything that we discussed here, all of that will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com/169. If you missed last week's episode, I spoke with Dr. Gary Wenk about his upcoming book, The Brain, What Everyone Needs to Know, and also the interesting hints that marijuana in small amounts might be handy in fighting off brain inflammation as a person ages. Next week, we're going to be going into the animal kingdom, talking about animal brains, venturing a bit off the human track. So I will accept whatever level of hate mail people want to send me about not talking about something that's directly applicable to those of you who are listening who happen to be humans. But most of us like animals, most of us are interested in brains, and of course it's very interesting to hear both about the contrasts and the comparisons between human brains and animal brains, what makes us alike, what makes us different. So a special animal lovers episode in number 170 coming next week. And probably between now and then, if it hasn't hit already, a little overdose edition slipping in there, something between our regularly scheduled weekly episodes. So I will be back at you sooner than usual. Different time, but same podcast. And with that highly nutritious, easily digestible, and always unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.